Vanishing Point. Chapter 1. The Disappearance. Detective Daniel Rook stood by the edge of the riverbank, the wind biting at his face. The cold November air seemed to have frozen the entire town of Pinebrook in place, leaving a haunting stillness that gnawed at his senses. It had been 2 weeks since the first person went missing, and now there were 3 more. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. They had simply vanished. The town had fallen into a state of quiet panic. People locked their doors at night, whispering about curses or worse. But Rook didn't believe in the supernatural. There had to be a pattern. There always was. He just needed to find it before someone else disappeared. He turned back toward the cluster of officers gathered around the crime scene tape. The most recent victim, Grace Palmer, had been a local schoolteacher. She'd gone for a run in the park near the river and never returned. All they found was her cell phone, lying in the grass as though it had been gently placed there. Anything? Rook asked his partner, Detective Jenna Carter, as he approached her. She shook her head, her face pale and tight with frustration. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses. She sighed. It's like she was just erased. Rook stared at the spot where Grace's phone had been found, a hollow pit forming in his stomach. He'd been a detective for 15 years and had seen plenty of strange cases. But this one was different. There were no clues, no leads, just a growing list of missing people. We need to go over her routine again, Rook muttered. Someone had to have seen her. No one disappears into thin air. Jenna nodded. We've got officers talking to her neighbors and co-workers, but I don't think it'll lead anywhere. This doesn't feel random. Rook frowned. He'd been thinking the same thing. These disappearances, there was something almost methodical about them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far more sinister than a simple kidnapping or runaway. As they turned to leave, a voice called out, "Detective Rook." A young officer jogged over, holding a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a small metal pendant, delicate and intricate, with strange symbols etched into the surface. This was found near the riverbank, about 10 yards from where her phone was. Rook took the bag, studying the pendant carefully. It was old, worn, but the symbols were unmistakable. He'd seen something like this before, years ago during a case that had haunted him for a long time, a case he thought had been closed. His heart began to race as a terrible realization hit him. He hadn't seen the pattern before, but now it was starting to emerge. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was something much darker. He looked at Jenna, who had noticed the shift in his expression. "What is it?" she asked. Rook swallowed hard. "I think we're dealing with someone I've crossed paths with before." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Whoever or whatever was behind these vanishings had done this before, and if Rook was right, they were only just getting started. Want to know what happens next? Subscribe and share to uncover the dark secrets that lie ahead. Chapter 2. The Old Case. Back at the station, Rook sat at his desk, the pendant lying on the table in front of him. He stared at it, his mind spinning with memories he had tried to forget. The case he was thinking of had taken place 5 years ago, in a small town not far from Pinebrook. 3 people had gone missing under similar circumstances, but unlike this case, they had eventually been found dead. The killer had been meticulous, leaving behind no trace of evidence except for a series of these strange pendants. They had tracked him for months, but the trail had gone cold. The murders had stopped, and Rook had always assumed the killer had either fled or died. But now, looking at the pendant in front of him, he realized he had been wrong. Jenna walked over, her face filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Rook replied, pushing the pendant toward her. "This symbol, it's the same one from a case I worked 5 years ago. Same kind of disappearances. They stopped after 3 victims, but we never caught the guy." Jenna frowned, picking up the pendant and examining it. "And you think it's the same person?" After all this time, I don't know, but it's too much of a coincidence. Rook leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. We thought he was gone, but now it looks like he's back. Jenna sat down across from him, her brow furrowed. What do we do now? If this guy's been laying low all these years, he might be more dangerous than ever. Rook nodded grimly. We dig harder than we've ever dug before. He slipped through the cracks once, but I won't let it happen again. As they sat in silence, the weight of their task pressing down on them, a knock came at the door. It was Officer Michaels holding a file. Detectives, you're going to want to see this. We've got a witness. Rook and Jenna exchanged a look before following Michaels down the hallway to the interrogation room. Inside, a young woman sat at the table, her hands trembling as she sipped from a cup of water. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. She says she saw someone near the park the night Grace went missing, Michaels explained in a low voice. She's scared, but she's willing to talk. Rook's pulse quickened. Finally, a break. He stepped into the room, Jenna right behind him, and sat across from the woman. I'm Detective Rook, and this is Detective Carter, he said gently. We understand you saw something the night Grace Palmer disappeared. We're just here to listen. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between them. I don't know if what I saw is important, she stammered. But there was a man. I saw him near the trees, watching her. Rook leaned forward. What did he look like? She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. He was wearing a hood. I couldn't see his face, but there was something wrong with his eyes. They glowed. Rook felt a chill run down his spine. He exchanged a glance with Jenna, who looked just as unsettled. Thank you, Rook said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. You've been a big help. As they left the room, Jenna spoke in a hushed voice. Glowing eyes? What does that even mean? Rook didn't have an answer. All he knew was that whatever they were dealing with, it was far more dangerous than they had imagined. Can you feel the tension rising? Hit subscribe and share to find out what terrifying twists lie ahead. Chapter 3. The Witness. The next morning, Detective Rook couldn't shake the image of the witness describing the man with glowing eyes. He'd heard strange things over the years, but something about this detail gnawed at him. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Jenna. Meet me at the station. There's something you need to see. Rook grabbed his coat and hurried out the door. By the time he arrived at the station, Jenna was already waiting for him. A stack of files spread out across the table. Look at this, she said, her voice tense with urgency. I pulled up everything we had from that old case you mentioned. The disappearances were eerily similar, but there's one big difference. She slid a photograph across the table. This was found near one of the old victims, an eyewitness sketch from years ago. Rook froze as he studied the sketch. It was a crude drawing of a man, face shadowed by a hood, but the most disturbing part was his eyes. They were hollow with faint lines around them, as if they were emitting some kind of light. This can't be a coincidence, Jenna whispered. Two witnesses, years apart, describing the same thing. Rook's hands tightened around the edge of the photo. He had hoped that the old case had simply been a cruel trick of memory or misunderstanding, but now he was certain this was the same person, the same monster. Any chance this is some kind of group? Rook asked, his mind racing. Someone picking up where the last guy left off? Jenna shook her head. I don't think so. Whoever this is, they've been playing a long game, and we're only just catching up. Rook cursed under his breath. Time was running out, and he knew the killer wouldn't stop with just one more. There was always a pattern, and it was only a matter of time before another victim disappeared. We need to talk to the witness again, Rook said, standing up. She saw more than she realizes. The tension between them crackled like static electricity as they left the station and headed to the small, nondescript apartment where the young woman was staying. Officer Michaels had set her up in a safe house for her protection, but Rook couldn't help but feel like it wasn't enough. They knocked on the door, and after a moment, the woman opened it, her face pale and drawn. Detective Rook, she said, her voice shaky. "I told you everything I know." "We believe you," Jenna said gently, "but we need to go over some details again, just to make sure we haven't missed anything." The woman nodded, stepping aside to let them in. As they sat in the small living room, Rook noticed how tightly she held onto her cup of tea, her hands trembling. "You said the man you saw had glowing eyes," Rook began, keeping his voice calm. "Can you describe them in more detail? Was it a reflection? A trick of the light?" The woman shook her head quickly. "No, it wasn't a reflection. His eyes, they were unnatural, like they didn't belong to a human." Rook exchanged a look with Jenna. "Did you see anything else? Any symbols? Any unusual markings on him?" She hesitated, then slowly nodded. "There was something on his hand. A tattoo, maybe. I only caught a glimpse, but it looked like a circle with strange symbols inside it." Rook felt his heart skip a beat. The pendant, it had the same symbols. "We need to move fast," Jenna muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This guy's not going to stop." Rook stood, his mind made up. "We're not going to let him get away this time." Eager to see what happens next? Subscribe and share to unravel the chilling mystery. Chapter 4. The Mark. Back at the station, Rook couldn't shake the image of the symbol on the killer's hand. He pulled out the pendant again, studying the intricate carvings. It was an ancient design, far older than the cases they were dealing with, and yet somehow connected. Jenna joined him, setting down a thick book she had borrowed from the local library. "I've been doing some research on these symbols. They're not just random shapes. They're part of an ancient occult language, one used in rituals." Rook raised an eyebrow. "Rituals?" "Yeah, but not just any rituals," Jenna said, flipping open the book. "These symbols are tied to a very specific belief system, one that revolves around sacrifice." The word hung in the air like a lead weight. "Sacrifice," Rook repeated, his stomach turning. Jenna nodded grimly. "If I'm right, the person we're dealing with isn't just a killer. He's part of something much bigger and much darker." Rook felt a chill run down his spine. The glowing eyes, the symbol, the disappearances. It all pointed to something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. This wasn't just a psychopath playing games. This was someone who believed they were following a higher calling. "We need to find out who this guy is, and fast," Rook said, standing up. "If he's planning some kind of ritual, we might be dealing with a timeline we don't know about." Jenna nodded, her face pale but determined. "I'll start digging into any cult activity in the area. Maybe we can find a connection." As Rook turned to leave, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and froze. Another disappearance. Chapter 5. The pattern emerges. The latest disappearance hit the town hard. Julia Marsh, a 22-year-old college student, had gone missing on her way home from work. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over, leaving Pinebrook teetering on the edge of hysteria. Rook stood in the center of the victim's dorm room, his eyes scanning every inch for something, anything, that might connect her disappearance to the others. But just like before, there were no signs of a struggle, no clues left behind. It was as if Julia had simply walked out and vanished into thin air. Jenna was by his side, her arms crossed as she stared at the empty bed. "We're missing something," she muttered. "There's a link we haven't found yet." Rook nodded, though frustration clawed at him. The ritual aspect ties this guy together, but how does he choose them? Why now? Jenna flipped through her notebook. Julia, Grace, and the other victims all lived alone. No family in town. They were isolated in some way. But that can't be the only thing. "It's not enough," Rook agreed. "He's selecting them based on something deeper, something that connects them to whatever ritual he's planning." As they left the dorm, the weight of the case pressed down on Rook like an iron fist. They were running out of time. He could feel it in his bones. The killer wasn't just taking random people. He was building towards something. Jenna's phone buzzed. She checked the message and her eyes widened. "You're going to want to see this." They hurried back to the station where Jenna pulled up a map on the computer. I've been cross-referencing the locations where each victim was last seen. There's a pattern. On the screen, a cluster of red pins marked the spots where the victims had disappeared. As Rook studied the map, he noticed something strange. The pins formed a rough circle. "This can't be a coincidence," Rook said, leaning in closer. "He's working within a specific radius." Jenna nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she overlaid a new image on top of the map. The screen flickered to reveal the symbols from the pendant, the same ones etched on the killer's hand. "It's a perfect match," Jenna whispered. "He's using the town itself as part of his ritual." Rook stared at the screen in disbelief. "He's not just taking people. He's creating a pattern, something to fuel the ritual." Jenna turned to him, her face pale. "If we don't stop him before he completes the circle, whatever he's planning will come to fruition." Rook felt a chill run through him. The ritual wasn't just a series of random sacrifices. It was a meticulously crafted plan, and they were running out of time. What's the next move? Subscribe and share to see how this mystery unfolds. Chapter 6. Race Against Time. With the map in hand, Rook and Jenna drove to the outskirts of town, where the last disappearance had taken place. The pattern was clear. The killer was closing in on the final piece of his ritual. They needed to stop him before it was too late. The sun was setting as they pulled up to an abandoned warehouse near the edge of the woods. It had been empty for years, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut. But the eerie feeling in the air told Rook they were in the right place. "This is it," he said, stepping out of the car. "If he's going to complete the ritual, it'll be here." Jenna nodded, checking her gun as they approached the entrance. "I called for backup, but we're on our own until they arrive." Rook carefully pried the chains off the door, the metal groaning in protest. As they stepped inside, the darkness seemed to swallow them whole. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the empty halls. They moved slowly, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Every corner felt like a trap, every shadow a threat. But Rook knew they didn't have time to wait. If the killer was here, they needed to find him now. As they made their way deeper into the warehouse, Rook's heart pounded in his chest. The tension was unbearable, every second ticking away like a countdown to disaster. Then, they heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere up ahead. Rook motioned for Jenna to follow as they moved toward the sound, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until they rounded a corner and saw him. The killer stood in the center of a large, open room, a circle of candles flickering around him. His back was to them, but Rook could see the pendant hanging from his neck, glowing faintly in the dim light. In front of him, tied to a chair, was Julia Marsh. She was unconscious, her head slumped forward. "Put your hands up," Rook shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The killer didn't move. He stood still, as if he hadn't heard them at all. "I said, put your hands up," Jenna repeated, her gun aimed at his back. Slowly, the killer turned to face them, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Rook felt a cold wave of fear wash over him as he realized what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a man. This was something else, something far more dangerous than they had imagined. The killer smiled, a slow, chilling grin that made Rook's blood run cold. "You're too late," he whispered. Before Rook could react, the room erupted in a blinding light, the candles flaring up as the ritual reached its climax. Rook and Jenna were thrown back by the force of the blast, their bodies hitting the ground hard. When Rook opened his eyes, the killer was gone. Julia lay on the floor, unharmed but unconscious, and the candles had been snuffed out. The ritual had been interrupted, but for how long? The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.